John Redwood.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I remind the House of my declaration in the interest register that I offer advice to an industrial and an investment company. Madam Deputy Speaker, I rise to correct some of the myths that are emanating from the benches opposite, because they don't seem to read the figures, and I hope they will catch up with the budget detail from the Red Book now it is more commonly available. But what we are talking about here is a set of plans for a 5-year period, and what they demonstrate is that the government thinks that given the growth in the economy, they can afford to spend 60 billion a year more by the final year of the forecast period than they are currently spending. And the biggest change that this budget has announced is a very substantial increase in the planned amount of spending for the end of the period, for 2019-20, where the Chancellor is proposing a £38.1 billion increase in total managed expenditure in that year, well up on the figures in the autumn statement. And I think this is good news. It shows that the Chancellor is reflecting the confidence in the economy, reflecting the reduced cost of interest charges as the costs of borrowing come under better control, and reflecting the lower rate of inflation, which will have a very beneficial impact on the cost of providing public services.
She's given an impression there of a growing state, when in actual fact, from the Red Book, page 112, that what is happening in real terms is that as a percentage of GDP, this Chancellor and that party are cutting the state by 13%, which is going to affect the poorest in society, and that is a legacy of a Tory government.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm giving the cash numbers, and the cash numbers are very clearly set out on page 111. If you would be patient, I would go on and deal with the arguments about real terms and percentage of the economy. But I think you start with cash. The 60 billion increase in the annual spend at the end of the period is a big increase, and if we can keep inflation of costs down, it could give you a real increase. We had these arguments at the beginning of the last Parliament. When I quoted the cash figures, people said it would amount to a real decline, and we actually had a real increase. The last 2 years have seen real increases in total public spending, general public spending, as I indicated in a recent intervention, as this Red Book makes very clear. I hope the honourable gentleman will read the Red Book, and he will see that the last couple of years have seen real increases in general government current spending, because those have been affordable and the lower rate of inflation is helping. But when we look at the percentage of GDP, yes, it will be falling as a percentage of GDP. That is extremely good news, because it means that people will be keeping more of the money they earn from their productive activities. And as the economy is growing, it can still mean we have public services. One of the cruelest myths being put around by the opposition at the moment is this myth that if we did take public spending to 35% of GDP, we would be cutting it to 1930s levels. Well, it's complete nonsense. For most of the 1930s, public spending as a percentage of GDP was well below 35% anyway. But I did the numbers the other day, and in real terms, public spending this year is 9 times the level of real public spending in the early 1930s. 9 times in real terms. I give way.
Yeah, I mean, it's also statistically worth pointing out that the figure I think that where we are directionally heading towards is, I think, 35.2% of GDP.
No,
but it's worth remembering that when the member for Calvin-Beath was Chancellor himself, that the percent he was spending was, I think, 35.8 or 35.9%. Right, so it's not a huge difference from where we are going and where he was.
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, in order to make the point, the Chancellor has said he'll spend a little bit more in the last year of the period, so that we are exactly on the percentage of GDP that Labour thought appropriate in the year 2000. But you cannot say, because you're spending the same percentage of GDP, that you've cut spending or it's down in real terms. If you have a healthy, growing economy, your public spending is well up in real terms, as is the general size of the economy, and we should welcome that. What we want is growth in the economy, so that we can have growth in the range and quality of public services in an affordable way, and that's exactly what this illustrates. And I do hope that the party opposite will stop trying to con people into believing that somehow if you ended up at 35%, 1% lower than the Chancellor's going to, you'd have 1930s levels of public services. It is so absurd. I cannot believe they even dare to repeat this kind of nonsense day by day. What we want from this budget, and I think what it helps deliver, is more growth. And it's great news that we now have such good figures coming in on employment levels at record highs. It's good news that unemployment is reducing. It is good news that, in particular, youth unemployment is reducing. And I think in a way it's quite remarkable that this has happened over these 5 years when you consider two very important points of the background. The first is the state of the banks that was inherited in 2010. And I think this House has never really understood or grappled with the magnitude of what happened to the banking system under the party opposite, and the magnitude of the changes that were put through between 2008 and today with RBS and HBOS. But if you'd ask most economic forecasters what would happen to the UK economy if you took about £1 trillion of assets off two of your leading banks' balance sheets, I think they would have forecast that the economy would crash in a quite remarkable way. And what is fantastic for our country is that after the initial crash that Labour presided over in 08-09, we've managed to get the economy back to growth whilst mending the banks and whilst going through that extraordinary shrinking on the banking balance sheets. And I find it quite remarkable that the party opposite won't listen to this, because they lived through this dreadful experience. Their regulators allowed the banks to overexpand their balance sheets when many of us were saying this is going too far. Worse still, oh indeed we did. We constantly said that this was too lax. And I remember writing it in the Economic Policy Review in opposition for the Conservative Party that the regulation of cash and capital was too lax. There was far too much regulation of other things, but the things that really mattered, cash and capital, were far too lax and they needed to be tightened. But they then made the worst mistake with their regulators of over-tightening in a hurry and precipitated the major crash. And they do need to learn from this. We all need to learn from this because we don't want it to happen again. We need to understand why we had that very big crash in output and people's living standards and real incomes, and why it took time between 2008 and 2013 for the growth to resume. And it was because that banking system was so badly damaged, and it obviously took time to get that back into shape. And the other reason why we had problems, as the Chancellor himself referred to, was that we had in 2011 an extremely unpleasant euro crisis. And that does have some impact on Britain because we live by foreign trade as well as by our domestic activities. And we had to shelter ourselves from the worst of that, and we are in the process of orienting our trade much more strongly towards Asia and the Americas, the growing parts of the world, away from the European area, which is mired in recession and is still under enormous difficulties because it decided to create a single currency without creating a single country to back it and love it, and is having to live with awful strains and stresses as a result. As we meet today, this budget is an important event, certainly a very important event politically in the United Kingdom, but a far more important set of events are taking place on the continent with the hectic negotiations between Greece, Germany and the rest over whether Greece can stay in the euro or not. And it is not easy to see a happy outcome either way from those very pained discussions. But aren't we glad that in this country, thanks to some of us urging very strongly that we should stay out of the euro, we are not having to live with that awful experience? Well, the lady thinks it's funny that Greece has youth unemployment of 50%, but I don't. I think it's a disgrace that Greece has that level of youth unemployment. I don't think it's funny that several countries on the continent have general unemployment of 25%. It is quite unacceptable. The Labour Party would rightly condemn it every day of the week if it was happening here. It is not happening here because we ran our own economic policy and we've done a lot better job than they did on the continent.
Except that most of the problems of the European Central Bank are to do with a fixation on inflation, the same sort of fixation that he shares himself.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I have no fixation on inflation, but nor do I think runaway inflation creates prosperity. You need to manage inflation and you need to manage growth and you need to have an economy which can expand. I'm very pleased that this budget helps create and preserve the expansion which is now underway in the United Kingdom. I think it's very good news that there are things in this budget to promote more home ownership and saving. I think it's very good news that there are more things for enterprise and business to promote more jobs. What we want is more jobs and better paid jobs. And I was pleased to hear the Chancellor say that most of the jobs now are full-time jobs and that many of the jobs are highly skilled jobs. That is what this country needs: more skills, more opportunity, the chance for individuals to train, to work, to educate themselves well so that they can then get better paid jobs. That is what we all want in this House, and I sometimes regret those who seem to suggest that Conservatives don't want that. We want it as much as anybody else. We want more jobs, better paid jobs, more skilled jobs. And we know that we have to earn our money, and we want to create the opportunities for people to earn their money. This budget produces some sensible judgments over how much the country can afford in increased public spending. I think 60 billion is a perfectly good judgment for the amount of extra public spending by the end of the next Parliament. It sets out a judgment on how we finally get rid of the deficit and start to cut the debt. And I do find it a bit odd that Labour is both telling us that too much was cut in this Parliament and now saying that the deficit is too high. Well, I have news for Labour. You have to cut if you want a lower deficit. It doesn't just magic away. And the question is, how do you get that judgment right?
Wouldn't he not accept, though, dealing with the deficit, you can simply deal with the deficit by cutting, which is largely what his party's done, or you can do it in a more balanced way. You cut where you need to, you raise revenue where it's right to do so, and you make sure you get the growth to bring in the revenues, which was the fundamental problem with the policies at the beginning of this Parliament.
Figures just describe the policy of this government. They put some taxes up, they went for growth, which is now coming through, which does help tackle the deficit problem, and they had to reduce the over-optimistic spending plans of the outgoing government. And the final thing I wish to point out is that we were told that it was quite wrong to cut capital spending. Well, I seem to recall that the only bit of spending which Labour cut in detail before leaving office was the capital budget. They made massive cuts in capital, and this Chancellor has restored some of them, but because of the parlous state of the overall finances, couldn't restore all of them. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, a good package, good news that on home ownership, good news on employment, good news on growth, and a lot of myths that need to be put back into the dark room because they're not going to con the British public.